evening. My name is Brittany Lee Lewis, and I'll be your host. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode on American politics. I'm so excited to announce today's guest, which is Representative Vandana Slatter. She is a former Bellevue City Council member, community leader, public school parent, and biotech and healthcare professional. She currently serves as a member of the Washington State House of Representatives from the 48th Legislative District. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I want to begin a little bit about what influenced you to get involved in politics.
It's a great question because although public service was part of the DNA in my family in India, people who had worked in government and education, politics was not really considered a profession in my family. My father is a physician. He immigrated to Canada in 1960. And, I had two sisters, and we were encouraged to get a career and an education. But despite the fact that I was a student council president, I entered speech contests that had policy associated with them. I worked on a political campaign in college. I had never thought of politics as a profession. So I became a hospital pharmacist. And it wasn't until many years later, when I had my son, that for the first time I realized how impactful government and policy in my life and in politics really was. And that story is something that has influenced me as to and sort of planted the seed for me to many, even beyond that, years later, to actually run for office. My son was born in 1996, and a few years before that, President Clinton had passed the Family and Medical Leave Act. Mm-hmm. At the time, I was working at the Upjohn Company, and it's we're making innovative medicines. I had moved from hospital practice to the company to be a medical and drug information pharmacist. And I wanted to spend 6 months with my son to breastfeed him, to give him a strong start to life, and get my job back. And that policy allowed me to do that. I took unpaid leave to do it. And when I went back to work, I got a different position when I wanted, and it was in clinical research, working on an antibiotic. And this antibiotic was treating really, really difficult gram-positive infections. And 20 years later, when my father was dying of cancer, he'd had surgery and needed an antibiotic, and that was the antibiotic they gave him. And it worked well enough that it helped to prolong his life for a while for us to spend time with him. So the impact of this one policy by somebody who didn't know who I was, did not know my life, I wanted and made a difference not only in starting my son's life off strongly, because I didn't know anybody in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I lived. We didn't have a family support structure there. We had immigrated to the United States. And then later on to actually use my research and my knowledge, because I got my job back, and give me the economic ability through that time, is so powerful. And for me, effective government removes barriers so people can thrive and succeed in life. Mm-hmm. And so that was sort of the first step for me to think about that as something that might happen in my future. And I have a long 10-year linear path after that non-linear path, but I feel like that would be probably the best response to you in terms of how I see my role.
I love that. It's always very fascinating to hear how people's personal stories affected their decision to get engaged in politics, right? I guess the personal is political so many different ways.
Yes, it's part of our lives. I mean, how we work with each other and how our government and our democracy functions.
Absolutely. Kind of sticking with the personal a bit, you are the first Indian American elected to the Washington State House of Representatives. Today, as many as 70 Indian Americans are running for office around the nation. Why is it essential, to have Indian representation throughout the United States in politics? And what does that honor mean to you?
Yes, thank you. That is another great question. I think, we're starting to see that Indian Americans are actually one of the fastest growing ethnic groups in the United States. They contribute to the economy, to society, and are also now becoming a strong political force and a force on the political landscape. And we know that from the nomination of Kamala Harris for vice president. And so it was so moving, and it was interesting because I never thought I would be so moved, but when I saw that, I was very touched by it, because she brings, she brings the story of an immigrant to leadership, and frankly, that's another reason why it's so important that we are representing in government, because we also have a story. We have a narrative of our immigrant path that hasn't really been told in the same way that we've heard the stories of other immigrants and other ethnic groups in our society. And I think part of the honor of being a representative is to be able to tell that story, about the story of our parents coming from India and to a land of opportunity, to build potential, to have freedom, to contribute to a society where where women can have the choice to study and to lead and to have a career. And I think it's incredibly important, because we value education. And so we are seen as as doctors and engineers, and we have this background, at least in my family. And but my father grew up on a farm with no running water and with an outdoor kitchen. And he, his father thought education was really important, and he traversed the ocean to come to a completely different country in 1960. And that story is something, as kids, as we look at our parents, we watch that and we learn from that. And because of them, we were able to be successful in our lives here. And I think it's an important representation, not only of other immigrant stories and other cultures and backgrounds, but truly the American story, right? And so as we are thinking about how do we, what can we bring to the table? What can we bring? Because a diversity of voices, in my view, enriches democracy, it enriches government, enriches our community, and helps us solve problems. And it helps us work together to build a better future and a stronger future for our children. So I'm so proud to be an Asian American woman sitting at the table, a voice at the table to support women, to support scientists, to support my Indian background and immigrants, but also to tell a very unique story. And I also think that the other reason is that we can be a bridge too, because growing up in North America, I grew up in Canada, immigrated to the United States as a young woman, and we can be a bridge too, because I remember straddling two cultures when I went to school. In a school, no one looked like me. And trying to find those catalysts and those bridges as we're learning about each other's culture and our society and solving problems is really important. So perhaps that's a role we can also play, and I hope to play as a representative.
What a wonderful story. I love that. I want to transition just a bit. So you helped establish the Lake Hills Greenbelt Urban Farm, which has a social business focus where healthy organic produce can be provided to low-income households at affordable cost. And we know so many areas have these food deserts, which make it impossible for people to access healthy produce. I really want to know what moved you to get involved in the business of affordable organic produce, and do you believe your success with it can be scaled and turned into a model for the nation?
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. It's a project and work that I was honored to be involved with some real leaders in this space. A number of years ago when I ran for city council, and I lost my seat, but I was still learning about the community and engaging with it. So it's now called the Bellevue Urban Garden, or TBUG, and it's a wonderful place for educational gardening, for crops to support low-income households, STEM-focused curriculum for students, and yes, it promotes the idea of social business. But the idea was really a vision seeded by Mabin Chisabuka, who's a local urban farmer, Narima Amin, who ran a global social business nonprofit, and Sophia Pastor, who is the director of Farmer Frog, an urban farming cooperative and educational nonprofit. And they had this vision of a community garden, where volunteers could learn sustainable organic farm practices, taking a share of the yield share of the yield, and then also a place where you could learn about science of plants and biology for students and young people. But at the time, I was just learning about the idea of social business. I had joined the board of Narima's organization and had been supporting Sophia in her work. And they came to me with this idea that they wanted to lease about 2.75 acres of underutilized land that had been there for farming and growing things in Bellevue, in the heart of Bellevue, which is a suburban city. And so I connected them with people at the city level and got the mayor interested. And this sort of group of people came together and said, we think we can do this. And so it is a wonderful model because it suggests that food forests, which are so important in communities with food deserts, are possible with a collaborative thought process around valuing seeding communities with these types of ideas. The thing is that we need to expose our community leaders to what's possible, even in small spaces, right? But you're seeing with the COVID crisis how important food security is and food stability. People are growing produce in their backyards, and they're learning how to work with the land. And seeing children, when you see them at this garden, working with their hands and learning about plants and their huge curiosity about it, you can see that we still have an incredibly strong connection to the land. I don't know what it was about this project that, there's so many other things, like your question is so real, because part of it is that my father grew up on a farm, and I remember visiting it as a young child. I honestly think that I was one of the somebody asked me once, when was the first moment you remember feeling the most free? And I remember just running through the farm, like running through the fields and feeling free there, and as a young girl. And so I feel like we are connected to our land. We do need to understand where food comes from, but it will take education, and maybe it starts with our children. But when I see people there at the urban garden planting things and talking about this huge pumpkin that just grew recently and getting excited about the wonderful food that's coming out of there, I don't think you need a really big project to do it. I think you just need small, seeds that are planted all over our nation. And I do think that's happening. So I hope that helped to answer your question.
Well, kind of sticking on the topic of, the land and the earth, you have an extensive background in science and technology, including 2 decades of experience as a clinical scientist, You currently work as co-chair of the House of Representatives Science, Technology, and Innovation Caucus. What, in your opinion, are the dangers associated with electing officials that don't actually believe in science?
Well, we can just look at this current crisis, the current COVID crisis, to absolutely see the incredible damage that not listening to scientists, not listening to their warnings, not heeding scientific information or evidence can cause. We've seen over 200,000 people die. We have, we have an economy that's in free fall. We have children who can't go to school. We have no cohesive national strategy. We have healthcare workers who are continuously working to save lives without adequate personal protective equipment, who are dying of COVID, for some reasons unnecessarily, in my view. We have communities of color and those who are disproportionately affected by this virus in ways that, that we can prevent this harm. And to me, as well, when we have absolutely divested dollars from and completely undermined our institutions like the National Institutes of Health, like the CDC, the FDA, and made them, basically shells in some ways of their former pandemic response. selves and created distrust in even the data that's coming out of the administration, even in these very formally very trusted organizations. I just think that we have really seen the damage of not listening to science. And frankly, science is one language that has been developed by our society. That's a really amazing thing, because what it is, it's not really one answer. What it is a process. It's a curious process and procedure of testing information, even with different groups, to find reproducible results that provide us really solid information that, even if we don't feel like it's the right information, it provides us an objective place to begin. So the biggest damage that we do when we don't listen to science or scientists is we slow problem solving down, because we can't get to a common set of facts and understanding to be able to begin a conversation that leads us to solutions. So I feel like that's the thing that I feel so deeply. And it's sort of paradoxical to me that we don't listen to the evidence about, for example, wearing a mask or socially distancing. And yet our current president says that vaccines are going to solve the crisis. And vaccines use the same science and the same scientific method that all of the other tools that we've been saying should be considered to prevent further death and illness and infection. So to me, it's sort of picking and choosing from different science. Like, let's send a rocket to the moon and let's create a space force, but let's completely ignore the science on how we actually protect people's lives in medicine and healthcare and developing medicines. To me, it's just been a really difficult to watch this as a scientist and as a healthcare professional. I'm not practicing in those spaces anymore, but I definitely think that if we can get more legislators, in government that have that background, that have had that process and procedure, who can interpret the science, that's important. And I haven't even touched on climate change.
Don't worry, that's my next question.
So, so I guess.
Yeah, I mean,
not there, but
that's really my next question, which is, scientists have warned that global temperatures could reach an irreversible tipping point. I've seen things that are saying as soon as 7 years. I've seen other things that are saying in just 12 years. Either way, that's not very far. And, we need to drastically reduce the amount of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere, according to scientists. So, I am curious. I know you've been doing some work, in the legislature regarding this. So can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you've sponsored to help move Washington towards sustainable energy?
As a scientist, I recognize incredible threat posed by climate change. I mean, we talk about it as an existential threat because it's that significant. Our planet there's no planet B, as many people have often said. And you're right, we barely have a decade to act with urgency and force that's necessary to prevent or mitigate its worst outcomes. And we're seeing rising sea levels, melting ice caps, potential for climate refugees by dislocating people from where they live and work. We're seeing worsening hurricane and worsening wildfires, which affect our air, our pollution, our waterways, and the future of our children. So it's irresponsible, in my mind, in the face of a worldwide consensus of scientists. And remember, we talked about the scientific process earlier and how consensus isn't just one idea that they're sort of throwing around to each other. They're testing and retesting and coming to the same conclusion. So it's a very powerful, robust thing. And they are, if we delay action based on this consensus, especially when we can create thousands of new jobs and economic opportunity and see a cleaner future and a cleaner economy, it makes no sense not to act. So Washington State has done economy-wide or statewide initiatives that have not really passed So what the legislature did was in 2008, we set some goals for decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. And then President Obama signed us onto the Paris Climate Agreement. And President Trump, when he was elected, took us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So our climate goals were based basically in 2008 at the state level. And so I was proud to sponsor and lead efforts to pass HB 2311, and that just passed this past session. It took about 3 years to pass, but basically it aligns our emission targets with modern climate science. And the reason it wasn't a priority to pass is because the legislature was actually doing sector-specific work to decrease carbon pollution, reduce carbon and decrease greenhouse gas emissions in other areas. So, for example, the electricity area and industry, the utilities. And basically we passed 100% clean electricity bill that would get them to reduce energy significantly by 2045. Mm-hmm. And so that sector was then worked on, and then we looked at green transportation and sort of building up electric infrastructure for our public fleets and our public, buses, and providing incentives for, electric vehicles, for example. And so we sort of were taking it sector by sector. We did a bill on buildings and sort of like the big buildings so that they were not emitting as much emissions as like older buildings would. So taking it sector by sector, that's kind of how we've addressed it. But this year, I think we're pretty interested in looking at something that might be a broader economy-wide carbon policy. And I have leaders in fellow legislators who are priming this type of work. And I'm really excited to see what they're going to come up with to support a carbon policy, because there could be clean fuels, which I've been a very big supporter of. And we see that when we actually clean our fuels and allow more biofuels to enter that space, that we also reduce pollution to frontline communities and people who live near refineries and along highways. And that is so important because it gives us all a better future and a healthier future.
Are very impressive. I actually want to transition to something that really caught my attention. So you played a crucial role in passing Washington's landmark free and reduced college tuition bill, making higher education affordable for all students, paid for progressively by large businesses. Do you believe that the success of the free and reduced college tuition bill could potentially be a model for the nation, especially as so many people are struggling with student loan debt?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually just recently there was a report that said that this was a model for other states, and it was I'm trying to remember if it was and was considered the most equitable model as well, because we were basically providing free college to families that earn about 50,000 K or less. They're fully funded. So if you were more than that, then that was prorated. Really focusing on families that have not traditionally been given opportunities to go to college. I know you mentioned that you were the first to go to college in your family, which is a huge accomplishment and such an impressive thing. And just hearing the story of your path through education is really inspiring. And we want more people to have access to that, because I believe that just because you can't afford it doesn't mean you don't have something to contribute and offer, and that people's abilities are not defined by that and should not be defined that. And what I learned was that we're asking the question, why is the path to self-sufficiency and fulfillment in career and life and learning so difficult for so many students and young adults? And, we know that jobs, for example, if we're looking at careers outside of education, require education beyond high school. But our graduation rates is still under 80%. And only 40% of our high school students, and I think I'm speaking primarily about Washington State, but I don't think that's too different across the nation. 40% of our high school students earn a credential or degree by the time they're 26 years old. Wow. And meanwhile, businesses with family wage jobs can't find the workforce they need. And many Washington students are left behind to survive in a gig economy, trying to work to make ends meet with 3 different jobs with no real certainty or sustainability. So the bill that we passed actually had about 10 other bills in there. I had 2 of them. One of them was Career Connect Washington, which basically connects students, connects the classroom to career options through internships and apprenticeships and different pathways. And you could get credentials while you were taking these internships that you could put towards getting a job or towards going to college and further education. And also opportunity scholarships for those who are more underrepresented in STEM fields. And so, so women and lower income families and traditionally communities with ethnic backgrounds that have not had the opportunity to go into STEM fields and to learn about robotics and science and get internships and experience in those types of jobs to see if that's something that was interesting to students.
Right. I just really quickly, I want to transition to something about you that I think is a little known fact. It's very intriguing. You earned a varsity athletic letter in the sport of fencing, and you were captain of the UBC women's varsity fencing team and a gold medalist at the BC Junior Women's Foil Championships. What sparked your interest in this particular sport?
Well, I don't know, maybe you'll laugh. I was 17 at the time in university, and they had a clubs day, and I was checking out all the different clubs, and I had decided that I was going to try skydiving. That was the club. That was it. That was what I was going to do. And I'm like, I didn't tell my parents. I was interested in skydiving, but I really wanted to try it. Don't ask me why. And so I went to the skydiving booth, and they said, you're too young. The insurance won't cover you. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll walk around and I'll see what else there is. And I met this woman they were doing a fencing demonstration, and she was the women's coach. And she says, hey, have you ever heard about fencing? Have you ever thought to try it? And I thought, no. And I watched them, and they were amazing, doing all these really interesting things. And they were linking it to, modern media culture with, Monty Python and some of the other, Princess Bride. And so, we all know all of those types of movies, but we never really think about fencing. And she said, well, we're having a 2-week trial, and why don't you give it a try at the university here, and we've got a club. So I went, and there's not a whole lot of women that fence, okay? I mean, my women's team was 3 to 5 women and 30 guys. So I went, and I loved it, and I ended up being actually pretty good at it. And so I started to fence and path. I wish I'd started as a young girl. And so I love it when I hear about young girls starting, and I encourage them all the time to try it as a sport, because you don't have to be tall or super, you have to be quick, typically, especially when you're small. If you're tall, that helps. It definitely helps to be tall, but I wasn't. And it was a sport that was kind of like, physical chess. So it sort of fed my mind and my interest in strategy. And so I didn't expect it at all, but once I joined, and because it's such a small sport, the coaches who come and educate you and at the time it was Eastern Europe that was really sort of dominating the stage, and we had a very high-level Olympic coach who was doing an exchange with, I think, a hockey coach in Canada, and he had come to teach fencing. So we had the opportunity to learn at the highest level, which I think is why I had the skill level kind of was quicker because of that access. Mm-hmm. So I encourage people to try it, especially young girls. If you have an interest, I think it's a great sport.
Wow, it sounds fascinating. I'm certainly going to search the internet for some videos so I can see your fencing skills. Representative Slatter, it's been such a pleasure. We are running out of time, but just before we go, can you let people know where they can go to stay up to date with what you have going on and just follow everything that you're doing in politics?
Sure. I have a website, vandanaslatter.com. So it's my first and last name, VANDANASLATTER.com. And you can follow me there. You can also, I'm on Twitter at Slatter Vandana, and I'm on Facebook as well. So any of those places, you can see what I'm up to, and definitely, I am also available to be emailed at my legislative email, and certainly you can search for that, or you can just send an email to vandana.slatter@leg.wa.gov.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I truly appreciate this conversation.
Awesome. And to our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time.